Hello everyone. It seems that Ordro just keeps releasing more camera models, each time with the same fancy ads, grand claims, and seemingly fake reviews. There's always the possibility that they will get their act together and release a camera that represents a good value for someone looking for an inexpensive camcorder. Alright, future me here, and I just wanted to pop in here to show something I found while editing this video. One of the things that I have noticed since the start, as soon as I got this thing, is that the memory card that it came with was just unusually tight in my memory card reader. In fact, most of the memory cards that have come with these cameras are just kind of extra tight in my memory card reader. Didn't think a whole lot of it, but this time, when I was putting it in the memory card reader, it was catching even more than normal, and I realized, oh, that's just because the sticker is peeling up a little bit on the edge. But I got to looking a little bit closer, and this is the Kingston card that comes with this Ordro camera. In fact, all of them come with Kingston cards, but no, they don't. What they actually come with is something generic with a Kingston sticker on it. That's why they're all tight. And man, fake cards. You're making it really hard for me to give you the benefit of the doubt on anything here, Ordro. That there is what we call a lie. This here is one of their newer models, the AX60. Unfortunately, from what I can tell, this camera is virtually identical in specs to the AC5 I reviewed a while back, and that camera wasn't very good. On Amazon, the AX60 can cost upwards of $400 if you get all the accessories. And like all of their various camera listings, it has a selection of suspicious 5-star reviews that praise its professional quality and great performance for the money. The AX60 is one of only a few Ordro models with optical zoom and autofocus. The camera has 12x optical zoom just like the AC5. They also have an AC7 that I have not tried, which has 10 times optical zoom. Also like the AC5, the AX60 says it's 4K, but it's actually 2880 by 2160 resolution that they call 4K. 4K, or Ultra HD, is actually 3840 by 2160. So 2880 by 2160 is simply not 4K, and it's also an odd 12:9 aspect ratio. Most programs will automatically play it at a 16:9 aspect ratio, and the image looks correct. But this is the first Ordro I've used where the files actually import into my editor at the 16:9 ratio, making everything look squeezed. I actually have to stretch it out in post. So it's definitely something that can cause annoyance at times, on top of not being actual 4K resolution. This camera also proudly advertises having a 5 megapixel sensor, which isn't even enough for 2880 by 2160. So there's that. This camera has Wi-Fi, as most Ordro cameras do, which allows it to connect a mobile device via an app. But I will not be downloading the app to test out this feature. The app is very bare bones in terms of features, and it has lots of poor reviews, with some saying it doesn't work at all. But most importantly, it requires a ton of permissions that I'm simply not willing to give a company like this. It requires permissions to view contacts, call logs. It requires permission to access what the Play Store calls sensitive log data, as well as account data and other identity data. It also requires permission to draw over other apps, full network access, control over Wi-Fi connections, access to precise GPS and network-based location, and more. I'm simply not willing to give the app all those permissions, so I won't be testing the Wi-Fi features. I will give this camera props for a couple things that I think are better than the AC5. It has a more balanced weight compared to the very back-heavy AC5. It has a slightly larger touchscreen, and the touchscreen aspect is more responsive and it works fine. You can also just use the arrow buttons though, which sometimes is just easier. Unfortunately, the camera suffers from the same unhelpful battery gauge behavior. It will bounce between full to 1 bar and back to full based on what you're doing at the time, or sometimes at complete random. Judging how much recording time you have left based on the battery gauge is virtually impossible. If you start with a full battery and start recording, it'll last for about an hour. If you record continuously, the recording stops at 34 minutes. It does automatically start recording again, but it is not seamless even when you combine the videos in post. If I had to guess, I'd say you lose about 5 to 6 seconds. The catch that holds the battery in place is almost pointless, as the battery instantly pops out far enough that the camera powers down. The door holds the battery in far enough that the camera works okay, but if you were to ever accidentally open that, the camera is going to power down. The little strap on the side is mounted all the way at the bottom, and it's way too loose even when adjusted, as absolutely tight as it'll go. It also places your hand too far back on the camera, so the buttons are in awkward positions. This means I have to use my middle finger for zoom, and my index finger constantly brushes up against the photo button. That photo button is extremely sensitive, and even lightly brushing the button with my finger pauses the video when recording and switches to photo mode when not recording, and that happens a lot. Plus, the shape of the side is kind of angled that way, which kind of seems like it wants to push the camera away from my hand, so I have to kind of bend my wrist at an odd angle to actually be able to hold the thing properly. It's just awkward and non-ergonomic at all to use, particularly with one hand. Compare that to something like the Sony CX405, where the strap holds the camera tight against my hand, and my fingers just naturally rest right at all the controls. The Sony feels like it was designed to be ergonomic to fit the hand. The Ordro kind of feels like it was designed by aliens to mimic the look of a camcorder, but they had no idea why camcorders actually look the way they do. It's all there, but none of it's quite right. More so than any other cheap camcorder I've tested, this one is just kind of awkward and non-ergonomic to hold. As for performance, it has the typical high contrast, highly sharpened look with high noise reduction as well. It can give a punchy first impression, but you do start to realize that the actual detail isn't that great, the colors are inaccurate, the dynamic range is really low, and it has an overly processed look at times. Sometimes changing the white balance mode improves the colors, but none of the white balance settings give particularly accurate color. And they really don't match what the modes are called. For instance, daylight mode tends to look best in cloudy conditions. Direct sun makes the daylight mode too warm and makes greens really strange. Auto white balance has a magenta shift and often looks a little cool. Most of the other modes had few, if any, situations where they really were usable. Now I've just switched to recording with the AX60. I'm using the included external microphone. And all the lighting and stuff in here is exactly the same. I didn't change anything except I swapped the cameras. Audio from the AX60 is mono only, and it has the same extreme noise cancellation that the AC5 had, which renders audio almost completely unusable in many situations. And even in the best of conditions, with a high quality microphone, the audio quality of this camera is still pretty poor. Can you hear those crazy insects? I don't know if you can, but man, are they loud. And here's the evening insects on the Sony. Man, they sure make a racket. The sky's starting to get pretty. And just so I don't leave out the Ordro and getting to capture that pink sky, here's what it looks like in the Ordro. ISO in this camera tops out at 400. It doesn't give usably bright results if the light gets very low at all. No lights on in the kitchen, but you can see it is daylight outside, and that's as bright as this camera gets. As I mentioned before, actual detail isn't great. It's not the worst I've seen, it's pretty much on par with a cheap 1080p camcorder. But it's certainly not as good as a high-quality 1080p camcorder, and it's nowhere near 4K levels of detail. The optical zoom range of this camera is decent, but without any kind of image stabilization and some pretty bad rolling shutter, it's pretty much unusable handheld. However, the biggest problem from this camera is the autofocus. It's absolutely terrible and takes this camera from a low-quality, poor-value camera and drops it to a completely worthless piece of garbage. This camera doesn't actually have what I would consider continuous autofocus. It has a sort of single autofocus that happens automatically. I know that sounds silly, but it's like it's in single autofocus mode and the camera just hits the focus button to refocus when it thinks it needs to. Even in the best of situations, it does these jerky back and forth jumps to acquire focus that are jarring. And once it does that, whatever you get is what you get until it decides to try again. Sometimes it simply refuses to try again, and you're left with a completely out of focus image that simply never focuses. And the rest of the time, it simply continuously pulses over and over and over endlessly. Granted, the camera has a ton of other issues, but the autofocus alone is more than enough of a problem to completely ruin this camera. With the battery out and all the accessories off, this camera is a lot lighter than the AC5, and just based on the balance and the feel of it, I don't get the impression that it has a bunch of just unnecessary, pointless metal inside. So, if nothing else, at least that might be a step in the right direction. But this Ordro is still advertised as a feature-rich 4K camcorder with great value and great performance for the money. But a Sony CX405 is actually less expensive and is dramatically superior. Ordro keeps releasing these cameras, and each one is an opportunity to provide a good value, a budget option, and something that is worthwhile for customers. Unfortunately, the AX60 is yet another horrible performing, low quality, overpriced camera with specs that are misleading at best. Sorry Ordro, but this is the same junk as the AC5, packaged into a less ergonomic form factor. The camcorder market is in a tough place right now. Deals are tough to find, stocks are low, and prices are up. But even with the current situation, I still recommend against these cameras. Even something like a DJI Osmo Action will take far better video with far better audio. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know. As always, thanks for watching. Take care.